Elias Harper had lived alone for 8 long years, but silence ended the night they dragged an Apache girl beneath the old cottonwood tree in the center of Cold Pine. The deputy's stars caught the lantern light as they tightened the rope. The preacher's voice wavered in prayer, but to Elias it sounded hollow, blood-stained, nothing like the scripture his wife once read aloud at dusk. The crowd shifted uneasily, boots scuffing against hard earth, but no one stepped forward. Cold Pine hadn't cared for justice in years, not since Sheriff Caleb Brackett had sold the law to the highest bidder. The girl's feet left the ground, and Elias froze. The sack of oats slipped from his hands, grains spilling into the dirt. He expected the limp sway of death, but instead he saw the desperate twitch of lungs still fighting. She was alive, barely. Her eyes, dark, unflinching, remained open, staring past the noose as if refusing to give Cold Pine the victory of fear. The wind tore through the valley like a knife. Each gust whispered the same truth: mercy no longer belonged here. For the first time in years, Elias felt his hand move toward the knife at his belt. It wasn't thought. It was instinct, an old muscle memory from a life he had buried deep. The last time he'd seen a woman in a deerskin dress, his wife was still alive, laughter filling the cabin he now haunted like a ghost. His chest tightened. That memory cut sharper than the wind. He looked at the deputies, smug in their false authority. At the preacher, lips moving but eyes hard with cruelty. At the townsfolk, silent behind shuttered windows, hiding from their own shame. And then back at the girl, still breathing, still fighting. A verse surfaced unbidden from the Bible his wife once held close. "The Lord is close to the broken-hearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Elias whispered it under his breath, though no one heard but the wind. This wasn't law, it wasn't justice, it was murder dressed in Sunday clothes. He stood rooted beside his wagon, but something inside him shifted. For 8 years, Elias Harper had chosen silence. That night, watching a young woman dangle from a rope while her spirit refused to break, he knew silence had come to its end. That night, Elias didn't sleep. He lay on his cot above the stable, boots still on, eyes fixed on the rafters overhead, while the wind rattled loose boards like restless bones. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw hers, open, defiant, unyielding even with a rope biting into her neck. It wasn't her beauty that haunted him, it was her silence. The kind of silence forged in fire, not fear. A silence that shouted louder than any scream. Moonlight spilled silver across the valley as he rose quietly, his rifle left behind. He didn't need a bullet, not tonight. Just steel. Just resolve. His boots whispered against the dust as he slipped down the slope, past the dry creek bed and the leaning church. The cottonwood tree loomed ahead, its branches stretched wide like a gallows built by nature itself, always hungry for another soul. No guards, no torches, just the girl, swaying gently as though she were already part of the night. Elias moved fast once he reached her, knife drawn, breath steady. One clean slice through coarse rope, and she collapsed into his arms, light as smoke. Her chest hitched, a ragged breath clawing free from her throat. Still alive, skin cold, dress torn where the noose had rubbed raw. Her wrists were bound as well, rope cutting into bruised flesh. He worked carefully, cutting her free, afraid to hurt her more. She didn't open her eyes, didn't speak. But her breathing, faint as a whisper, told him enough. She was still with the living. He didn't look back. There was no need. Cold Pine had made its choice. So had he. By the time Elias carried her to the edge of his land, the first thin glow of false dawn stretched over the eastern ridge. His cabin waited in silence, chimney cold, windows dark. A place built not for company, but for hiding. He laid her gently on his cot, pulling down an extra wool blanket from the shelf. The stove crackled to life as he poured water into a tin pot. Shadows danced across the walls, flickering over her bruised neck, the dried blood at her temple, the dirt ground into her skin. She couldn't have seen 20 summers. Yet in the sharp lines of her cheekbones, in the scar cut deep across her palm, he saw survival, not innocence. Elias sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. 8 years he had lived alone, burying his grief beneath the dust. Now this girl, this stranger, marked for death, breathed his air. And deep inside, a truth settled heavy in his bones. The men who had strung her up weren't finished, and neither was she. The fire burned low as sleep finally stole him in the rocking chair, rifle across his lap. Somewhere in the night, a whisper seemed to ride the wind, almost scripture, almost memory. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The valley held its breath as Elias Harper moved beneath the branches of the cottonwood. Its limbs reached wide, black against the rising moon, like a giant that had grown fat on the weight of bodies. The girl's shadow swayed gently, rope creaking in the stillness, her silence echoing louder than any cry could. He cut her down with one swift stroke. The hemp split with a sigh, and she collapsed into his arms, lighter than he expected, almost weightless. For a long moment he stood there, staring at her face in the dim light. Her lips were parted, skin pale, but breath still whispered through. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of smoke from the town. Elias glanced once over his shoulder. Windows shuttered, lamps snuffed out. The people of Cold Pine had sealed themselves away in silence. No witness, no resistance. They had surrendered justice to Sheriff Brackett and to the preacher who spoke blood in the name of God. He didn't linger. Every heartbeat was a gamble. If any man saw him with her, the rope meant for her neck would find his too. Carrying her was no burden. 8 years of splitting rails and hauling stone had left him wiry and strong. He crossed the dry creek bed, the stones glinting under the moonlight, past the leaning church that looked more like a coffin than a sanctuary. Each step forward felt like betrayal, to the town, to the law he had once believed in, but his body refused to stop. When he reached the northern ridge, the first gray shimmer of false dawn was already smudging the horizon. His cabin appeared through the trees, a weather-beaten box of logs with no smoke in its chimney, no welcome in its windows. Just 4 walls and a roof, enough to keep the rain out and the ghosts in. Inside, the air was cool, stale with the scent of pine resin and dust. Elias laid her on the narrow cot, pulling the wool blanket across her body. Her wrists were raw from the rope, the skin rubbed down to welts. He cut the bindings slowly, careful not to break the skin further. She didn't stir, not even when he brushed the dirt from her temple. The stove crackled to life with a handful of kindling. He poured water into a tin pot, set it to boil, and sat back heavily on the chair. For the first time, he let himself exhale. She couldn't have seen 20 summers. The sharp line of her cheekbones carried strength, not fragility. The scar across her palm looked old, deliberate, an Apache mark of survival, not accident. He traced it with his eyes, not daring to touch, and knew this wasn't the first rope she had slipped. A thought pressed at the edge of his mind. The men who had strung her up would come looking. Not for justice, but for pride. A lesson unlearned was a threat unanswered. And Cold Pine thrived on making examples. Elias rested his elbows on his knees, clasping his hands until the knuckles went white. 8 years alone, he had buried himself in silence. But tonight, the silence had been broken, and the choice he had made beneath that cottonwood tree would draw fire sooner than dawn could rise. The first sound Elias heard was the creak of old wood. His rifle was across his lap, his body slumped in the rocking chair, when the soft rustle of a blanket pulled him back from half-sleep. He blinked into the dim glow of the stove. The girl was awake. She sat propped against the wall, eyes scanning the cabin like she wasn't convinced it was real. Her lips moved, cracked and dry, before a whisper found its way out. "Where am I?" Elias didn't move, didn't reach for the rifle. He kept his voice low, steady. "My land, my cabin, 6 miles north of Cold Pine." Her gaze lingered on him, suspicious, as if weighing whether he was enemy or savior. After a long pause, she pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "They hung me." "They tried." The silence stretched again. Elias let it. Trust wasn't free in these parts, and he respected her caution. He poured water into a tin cup, held it out. She took it slow, hands trembling only once before steadying again. The water slipped down her throat in measured sips, as if she expected poison. After a moment, she set the cup down. "My name is Ahyoka," she said quietly. "It means she brought happiness. At least, that's what it used to mean." Elias nodded once. "Elias Harper." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You ain't law." "No. But you cut me down." Seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him for a long moment, then offered a faint smile, if it could be called that. Not warmth, not gratitude, but the ghost of a memory, as though her face remembered once knowing how. "They said I stole a horse," she whispered. Her fingers brushed the bruises at her wrists. "Said I was trouble." Elias leaned forward, voice flat. "Did you?" Ahyoka's eyes flicked toward the fire, flames dancing in her pupils. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was louder than words. Elias didn't push. Some truths came slow, bleeding out over time. Instead, he clasped his hands together, staring into the stove. "If anyone knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin." The verse from James rose unbidden in his thoughts, as clear as if his wife had spoken it from the grave. He shifted in the chair, heavy with the weight of it. "They'll come looking," Ahyoka said finally. "It wasn't a question." "Yeah. And if they find me here, they won't forgive you." Elias looked at her then, really looked. Beneath the bruises, beneath the suspicion, there was steel in her eyes. Not the steel of hatred, but of endurance. "I reckon forgiveness ain't what I'm after," he said quietly. The words hung between them. Outside, the wind clawed against the walls, carrying with it the howl of coyotes and the far-off echo of a restless town. Inside, in the flickering firelight, two strangers shared a silence that was no longer empty, but heavy with the promise of what was coming. The girl slept again before dawn, her breathing shallow but steady. Elias sat in the rocking chair, staring at the embers in the stove as the fire burned low. His cabin was quiet, but his mind was not. He had seen enough to know what awaited her. Out here, guilt didn't matter. An Apache accused of theft was guilty the moment someone said the word. In the eyes of Cold Pine, her trial had already been held, and the rope was the verdict. It wasn't always that way, he thought. Once justice had weight. Once lawmen had bled for something better than coin. But that had been years ago, before the war, before the railroads carved the land like open wounds, before greed drowned out mercy. Elias leaned back, eyes closing for just a moment. Memories came in sharp flashes. The scream of dynamite ripping through mountains. Men scattered like dust when negotiations failed. Smoke choking the lungs of towns caught between two rail companies willing to kill for a mile of steel. They called it progress. He called it ruin. He remembered the blood, too. Not just enemies, but brothers in arms, left broken in the dirt because some foreman decided death was cheaper than compromise. He still carried the scars, along his arms, across his chest, etched deeper in his heart. And then Mary, his wife, the last flicker of gentleness in a world gone hard. She had read scripture to him on storm nights, her voice the only sound stronger than the wind outside. He could still hear her saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." He had wanted to believe it, but Mary was gone, the grave holding her in silence, and he had not made peace, not with the world, not with himself. His eyes drifted back to the cot.
Ahyoka lay wrapped in the blanket, bruised but unbroken. He wondered what ghosts followed her. Whole villages burned, tribes pushed from their land, children marched in chains. The Apache had been branded enemies of progress, as if their very existence was theft. The scar on her palm caught his gaze again. Survival, not surrender. He respected that. In it, he saw a reflection of himself, someone who had endured because there was no other choice. The wind rattled the shutters. Elias rubbed his jaw, heavy with thought. He knew what the town wanted. They wanted her gone, forgotten, a message to any who dared defy their order. And if they couldn't find her, they'd settle for punishing the man who stole her from the rope. He should have felt fear. Instead, he felt clarity. His silence had kept him alive these 8 years, but it had also buried him. Now, for the first time since Mary's passing, he felt something stir. A weight, yes, but not despair. Purpose. The fire hissed as a log split in the heat. Elias whispered to the empty room, though his words were not for the girl, nor for himself.
"Lord, give me strength to do more than survive." Outside, the horizon blushed with the first true light of morning, and with it came the certainty that Cold Pine's quiet would not last. By mid-morning, Elias was outside splitting fence rails when he heard the horses. The rhythm of their hooves carried through the dust like a slow drumbeat, steady, deliberate. He set the axe aside and straightened, squinting into the glare rolling off the southern ridge. 4 riders approached, the sun glinting off gunmetal and deputy stars. At their head was Sheriff Caleb Brackett. Same battered hat, same worn badge pinned to his chest, though it looked more like a scar than an emblem of law. Once, long ago, Elias had called him brother-in-arms. Now he looked at him and saw only the man who had traded justice for coin. The riders pulled up short of the fence line. Brackett tipped his hat with a thin smile. "Mornin', Harper." Elias didn't answer. "Heard there was trouble in town last night," the sheriff went on. "Girl went missing. Some say they saw tracks headed north. Small prints, barefoot, fresh. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Elias let the silence stretch, the wind tugging at the dust between them. Finally he said, "Plenty strange out here, Sheriff. Coyotes howlin' like ghosts, buzzards circlin' lazy, but no girl." Brackett's smile tightened. He leaned forward in his saddle, eyes sharp beneath the brim of his hat. "Now that's funny. Folks in town swear they saw someone carrying a body. Strong man, big shoulders, headed this direction." "I deal in fence posts and horses," Elias said flatly, "not in ghosts." The deputies shifted in their saddles, hands brushing the grips of their pistols. The air thickened. For a moment, Elias thought one of them might make a move, eager for blood. But Brackett lifted a hand, holding them steady. "Let's be clear, Harper," he said, his voice low now. "Harboring a fugitive makes you an accessory. And harboring an Apache? That's worse than sin out here. That's suicide." Elias met his gaze without flinching. "You done?" The sheriff studied him, the 2 men locked in the weight of years and choices. Then Brackett tugged his reins, turning his horse. "For now." The riders wheeled away, their dust hanging in the air long after they were gone. Elias stood there, jaw clenched, until the silence of the land settled again. When he stepped back inside, Ahyoka was already standing by the door, blanket around her shoulders, eyes hard. She hadn't heard the words, but she didn't need to. "They'll be back," she said simply. Elias nodded. "With more men, with fire, maybe." She tilted her head, studying him, as though searching for cracks beneath the scars. "And what will you do?"
He looked out across the land, scarred earth and weathered fences stretching toward the horizon. His voice was quiet but steady. What I should have done a long time ago. Outside, a hawk circled high, its shadow slipping across the ground like a warning. The law of Cold Pine had drawn its line, and Elias Harper had just stepped across it. Elias waited until the dust of Brackett's riders had settled beyond the ridge before he moved. The stillness of the land felt false now, like calm water hiding a current ready to pull a man under. He closed the shutters, bolted the door, then walked to the barn. The air inside was cool and damp, carrying the scent of old hay and iron. In the far corner, beneath a layer of planks, lay the trapdoor he hadn't opened in 8 years. His hand lingered on the latch, hesitating. For so long, he had sworn he'd never touch the past again. But the past had come knocking, and it had come with fire. The door creaked as he pulled it open. The pit beneath yawned dark, lined with sacks of blasting powder, coils of wire, and devices wrapped in burlap. Tools of war. Relics of another life, when rail companies had paid him to carve mountains apart, and when silence had meant survival. He crouched, pulling one bundle free. The burlap fell away, revealing sticks of dynamite still wrapped in wax paper. The sight of it twisted his gut. He remembered the thunder of explosions in narrow canyons, the cries of men swallowed by rock slides, the blood spilled over contracts written in lies. A shadow crossed the threshold. Ahyoka stood there, blanket draped over her shoulders, her face unreadable. Her eyes dropped to the cache, then back to him. "You built this place like a fortress?" she said. Elias shook his head. "No, I built it like a tomb. Just didn't know it at the time." He straightened, wiping dust from his hands. The blanket slipped slightly from her shoulder, and she caught it quickly, but not before her gaze flicked to the scars across his forearm. Pale ridges, jagged lines of memory carved into flesh. She didn't ask how he got them. She didn't need to. Scars like those weren't accidents. They were history written in skin. "Those men," she said softly, "they'll come with more than threats." "I know. They'll come to burn everything you've built." Elias glanced around the barn, the weathered beams, the tools, the fences beyond. He thought of Mary, of the nights she had sat by this same stove reading from her worn Bible, believing in peace he could never quite hold on to. His jaw tightened. "Then we'll make it cost them." He laid the dynamite carefully on the workbench, uncoiling wire with practiced hands. His movements were steady, not rushed, but there was a weight in every motion, as if each knot tied him tighter to the decision he had already made. Ahyoka stepped closer, her eyes following every action. "Why help me?" she asked at last. Elias paused, fingers brushing the fuse. He didn't look at her when he answered, "Because if I don't, then all I've done these 8 years is hide, and I'm done hiding." Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke from the town below. Brackett would return, Elias knew, with more men, with fire. But when he came, he would not find silence waiting. He would find a man ready to stand, scars and all. By the time the sun dipped behind the western ridge, the land had gone still. The kind of stillness Elias knew too well, silence before a storm. He and Ahyoka worked side by side in the fading light, their shadows stretching long across the dirt. He showed her where the wire ran from the barn to the fence posts, where the powder was buried shallow beneath the earth. She watched closely, memorizing every detail, hands steady even when the wind tugged at the fuses. There was no hesitation in her, only focus, the same unyielding presence she had carried even beneath the noose. They didn't speak much. Words weren't needed. A nod, a gesture, a glance was enough. Where one laid the trap, the other covered it with earth. Where one carried powder, the other checked the line. Their movements fell into rhythm, as though they had been doing this together for years instead of hours. At dusk, Elias set the last charge by the porch.
He straightened slowly, rubbing the stiffness from his back. Ahyoka was already there, wrapping wire around the post with practiced hands. She looked up when he approached. "You've done this before," he said quietly. Her expression didn't change. "Not like this, but war teaches all of us." He studied her a moment longer, then nodded. They were alike in that. Survivors of battles they hadn't chosen, bearing scars the world refused to see. Inside, the cabin smelled of gun oil and kindling. Elias set 2 rifles against the wall, checked the chambers of his revolver, then poured water into the kettle. The ordinary act felt strange, almost out of place, as though making tea in a tomb. Ahyoka sat by the stove, her blanket folded neatly beside her. She was sharpening a knife, slow, deliberate strokes against the whetstone. The firelight flickered over her bruises, but her eyes were clear, steady. "You could still leave," Elias said, his voice low. "Follow the creek west. You might get half a day's head start before they notice." She shook her head without looking up. "And you?" "I stay." Her jaw tightened. "You stay, you die." "I stay," Elias repeated, "and finish." For the first time, her eyes lifted to meet his. Something passed between them, understanding, recognition. Not gratitude, not pity, but a shared defiance. The kettle began to whistle softly. Elias poured 2 cups, setting one in front of her. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. They drank in silence, the warmth seeping through tin into cold hands. Outside, the night deepened. From the ridge came the faint bark of a dog, then another answering call. Signals. The first tremors of what was coming. Elias set his cup down, staring at the flames licking the wood. "When they come," he said, "they'll think it's just one man standing. They'll be wrong." Ahyoka slid the sharpened knife into its sheath, her face unreadable, but her voice calm. "Then let them come." The wind rattled the shutters again, but this time it did not sound empty. It sounded ready. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Night fell heavy over the ridge. The air was hot and dry, carrying the scent of pine and dust. Elias stood by the barn, lantern in one hand, checking the oil one last time. He had been waiting for this silence, the kind that pressed down too hard, too steady, before it broke. Then he saw it, a glint of glass far up the ridge. A signal mirror, just for a heartbeat, catching the last of the moonlight. His jaw tightened. They were here. Ahyoka appeared at his side, blanket drawn close, her knife glinting at her hip. She didn't ask. She already knew. "They'll wait for dark," she said quietly. "Then they'll come with fire." Elias nodded once. His voice was low. "Let them." From the edge of the trees, the first laughter rolled out. Low, drunken, cruel. Torches flared into light, one after another, circling the land like wolves with flame for teeth. The barn glowed orange under their sway, shadows stretching long across the dirt. Elias stepped forward, the fence rails at his back, shotgun cradled in his hands. He could see them now. Brackett's men, a dozen at least, rifles hanging loose at their sides, confidence dripping from every movement. They thought this was over before it began. A torch arced through the air, landing in the dry grass near the corral. The fire caught instantly, racing through the brittle weeds like paper, snapping and crackling as the wind fed it. Heat swelled, the first smoke curling upward into the night. A cheer went up from the ridge. Ahyoka's face was lit by firelight, sharp then still. She didn't flinch. She didn't turn away. Her silence was the same as it had been under the rope, unyielding, fierce. Elias's chest tightened. He had lived through ambushes, raids, and the thunder of dynamite echoing through canyons. But this was different. This was his land, his walls, his fences, his last refuge. And they were about to burn it down just to prove a point. The laughter grew louder. The torches crept closer, dropped along the fence line, tossed into brush and hay. Flames crawled outward in long fingers, reaching for the barn, licking the air with greedy tongues. The sky itself seemed to glow, red and angry. A voice rose above the noise, brackets, calm, commanding. "Harper, you've chosen your side. Don't make us drag you out. Step down, hand her over, and maybe we let you keep your skin." Elias didn't answer.
His eyes stayed fixed on the fire advancing toward his barn. Each flame was a line being drawn in the dirt, cutting away every option. Behind him, Ahyoka spoke softly, steady. "This is the point. No going back." He nodded, his grip tightening on the shotgun. The heat of the flames washed across the yard, the crackle of burning wood drowning out the laughter for a heartbeat. Elias Harper had built his life on silence, on fences meant to keep the world out. Tonight, the fire was tearing those fences down, and when it did, there would be no retreat, only the fight. The fire line crawled steadily across the slope, a living thing hungry for timber and flesh. Sparks leapt with every gust of wind, scattering like glowing insects. The barn's dry timbers groaned, already sweating under the heat. Elias moved with precision, not haste. Panic wasted time. He knelt at the base of the fence line, checking the wire he had strung earlier. The powder was buried shallow, the fuse coiled tight beneath the dirt. His hands worked as if they remembered what his mind tried to forget. The old skills of a rail war sapper, the art of turning earth and fire into weapons. Behind him, Ahyoka crouched low, eyes fixed on the horizon. The orange glow of torches bobbed like predators closing in. Laughter still echoed, but underneath it, Elias heard the scrape of boots, the metallic click of rifles. The men were shifting closer, emboldened by the flames. "They think it's over," Ahyoka said, her voice calm. "Let them." Elias's tone was flat, steady. He finished knotting the wire, checked the fuse, and rose to his feet. The heat washed over him, hot enough to sting. He looked at the fire advancing toward the barn, then at the figures beyond it. For a long breath, he let the sight settle inside him. The lawless men, the false torches of judgment, the town's silence that had delivered them all here. A verse rose unbidden, clear as the crackling flame. "Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows." His lips barely moved, but the words carried weight. Galatians 6:7, a scripture his wife once whispered over a grave. He wasn't speaking to Ahyoka, nor even to himself. He was speaking to the night, to the men who thought the land was theirs to burn, to the lawman who had traded justice for blood. A torch hit the barn's north wall. The dry board shuddered, flame licking up like a preacher's sermon. Elias raised his shotgun, firing a single blast into the dark. The shot cracked across the valley, not meant to kill, but to announce. The laughter faltered. A silence swept over the men, brief but sharp. For the first time, they realized the ranch was awake. Boots shuffled, orders barked. The men began to spread, rifles lowering, voices hushed. Brackett's calm baritone cut through it all. "Keep pressin', smoke him out." Elias reloaded, his hands quick, sure. He glanced at Ahyoka, who already had her knife ready, blade gleaming in the firelight. She met his gaze, unflinching. The barn timbers moaned as another torch hit, fire climbing higher. The animals inside whinnied, restless. Elias felt the weight of it, the years spent building these walls, the sweat that had soaked into the wood. He could let it all burn and run. He could walk away, as he had so many times before. But not tonight. He set his jaw, fingers brushing the matchbox in his pocket. If Brackett wanted fire, then fire he would have. The match flared, a tiny star against the darkness. Elias cupped it with his hand, the flame trembling in the wind, then bent low and touched it to the fuse. The spark hissed to life, racing down the wire like a snake eager to strike. He stepped back, shotgun raised. The hill answered. A thundercrack split the night, rolling through the valley with the voice of judgment. The barn erupted in a burst of fire and splintered wood, flames leaping skyward as if clawing at heaven itself.
Men screamed, some thrown clear by the blast, others not that lucky. Horses shrieked and bolted, tearing free of their reins. The ground shook, rattling through Elias's bones. For a moment the valley was chaos, fire, smoke, men stumbling blind in the dark. Torches dropped and rolled, setting brush aflame. Orders barked, panicked, lost beneath the roar. Elias didn't hesitate. He moved through the smoke, firing once, then again, each blast deliberate. A man fell, clutching his chest. Another spun, dropping his rifle. The survivors scattered, half blinded, their confidence burning away with the barn. From the corner of his eye, Elias caught movement. Ahyoka. She emerged from the haze, hair wild, knife gleaming red in the firelight. She moved swift and sure, striking low and fast, silent as the shadows. A man lunged at her, but she slipped aside, blade flashing across his arm. He howled, dropped his weapon, and crumpled. She didn't stop. 2 more came from the west fence. She met them without fear, her knife finding flesh, her silence sharper than steel. When she glanced toward Elias, her face was streaked with soot and blood, but her eyes blazed alive. She was no longer the girl hanging from a rope. She was a warrior, standing. 2 down, she called, voice hard but steady. Others scattered. Elias reloaded, smoke burning his lungs. He nodded once, tossing her his spare rifle. Then let's end it before they regroup. She caught it clean, chambered around without pause, and took her place beside him. Together they moved, shadows within firelight. The men who had come to burn them out now found themselves hunted. Every spark, every whisper of wind carried death. In the distance, Elias heard Brackett shouting commands, his calm voice fraying at the edges. The sheriff hadn't expected a fight, he had expected fear. The flames devoured the barn in a roar, its roof collapsing in a shower of sparks. The night pulsed red and black, the air thick with ash. Elias's hands stung from recoil, his ears rang with gunfire, but his focus was clear. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding. He was standing where the fire was hottest. Beside him, Ahyoka fired a shot that dropped another man. Her breath came hard, but her stance was unshaken. In the chaos, their movements found rhythm. Her knife, his shotgun, her rifle, his silence. Somewhere beyond the smoke, Brackett's voice rose again, hoarse now, but steady. This wasn't over. Not yet. Elias glanced at the flames consuming what had once been his refuge. He felt no regret, only resolve. The battle had begun, and there was no turning back. The fire had eaten half the corral, the barn nothing but a skeleton of black beams clawing at the sky. Smoke rolled across the yard, thick and bitter, stinging eyes and lungs alike. The screams had quieted, leaving only the crackle of burning wood and the occasional moan of the dying. Elias stood near the fence, shotgun heavy in his hands, chest heaving from smoke and strain. His ears still rang from the blast, but his eyes were sharp, cutting through the haze for any sign of movement. Ahyoka crouched by the porch, rifle raised, her face streaked with soot. Then came the sound of hooves, not many, slow, measured. From the ridge, a lone figure descended through the smoke. He moved calm, unhurried, like a man arriving for supper, not a battlefield. His horse carried him straight through the chaos, fallen men, burning grass, the smoldering ruin of the barn. He did not look down. He did not need to. Sheriff Caleb Brackett reined in 5 yards from the fence line. His long coat hung dust-stained, his badge dulled by ash, but his eyes shone cold, sharp as ever. He sat tall in the saddle, voice carrying clear over the fire's roar. "Harper?" Harper shifted, feet planted firm in the dirt. "Brackett." "You always did have a taste for fireworks." The sheriff's mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. 8 years hiding in silence, and now look at you, burning down your own land just to prove a point? Elias's grip tightened on the shotgun. "Better to burn it myself than let you take it." Brackett's eyes flicked to the cabin, then to Ahyoka standing at its porch. "So this is what it's about.
One girl.
You'd trade your life, your home, for an Apache? Elias said nothing. The silence was answer enough. The sheriff dismounted slowly, deliberate, boots crunching on scorched dirt. He walked forward, stopping just beyond the reach of firelight. His voice dropped, steady, almost conversational. You could have stayed hidden, Harper. No one would have blamed you. But you couldn't help yourself, could you? You saw the rope, and suddenly that silence you loved so much wasn't enough anymore. Elias's chest rose, heavy, but his gaze did not falter. Silence is what got us here. For a heartbeat, neither man moved. The world narrowed to two figures in the smoke, their history hanging heavy in the air. Once comrades, now enemies forged by choices neither could undo. Finally, Brackett spoke, his tone flat as iron. No more fire, no more men, just you and me, like before. He unclipped the revolver at his hip and let it drop into the dirt. The thud echoed like a drumbeat. Elias lowered his shotgun, eyes locked on the sheriff. The air between them trembled with something more dangerous than gunpowder: inevitability. Ahyoka stood frozen by the porch, watching. She did not speak, did not move. This was not her battle to fight. Elias stepped forward, each footfall crunching on the scorched ground. The firelight painted him in orange and shadow, scars bright against his skin. The time for hiding was gone. The time for reckoning had come. The yard fell into silence, broken only by the hiss of fire and the groan of collapsing timbers. Even the wounded seemed to hold their breath, as though the earth itself waited for what came next. Elias stood 10 paces from Brackett, the scorched dirt between them glowing faint with embers. The sheriff's revolver lay untouched in the dust. Elias let his shotgun slide from his grip, the wood thudding heavy at his boots. He was left with only the iron at his hip, the weapon that felt more like a curse than a tool. Brackett's eyes never wavered. "Like old times," he said softly. "2 men, 1 shot, the kind of justice this land understands." Elias flexed his hand, feeling the weight of the revolver against his palm. His heart did not race, not anymore. It beat steady, slow, as if it knew the rhythm of what must come. He thought of Mary's voice reading scripture in a cabin long gone. He thought of the girl by the porch, waiting, silent but alive because he had acted. And he thought of the years wasted hiding, letting silence rot into complicity. The sheriff raised his hand, counting off the paces. 1, 2. The men moved, boots crunching against ash. The distance stretched, then tightened with every step, like a rope pulling them into fate. At 10 paces, both stopped. The wind surged across the valley, carrying sparks, swirling ash between them. For a breath, neither moved. Brackett's hand hovered near his holster, fingers twitching with practiced patience. Elias's hand was steady, the weight of choice already made. "Last chance, Harper," Brackett called. "Step aside, walk away, let the desert finish what the war started." Elias's voice was low, almost a whisper. "No, not anymore." The world contracted. Every sound dulled, every flame slowed, as if time itself bowed to the inevitability of this moment. Then it broke. A single shot cracked across the valley. The echo rolled out, bouncing against the ridges, scattering the circling buzzards into the night sky. Brackett staggered, his revolver slipping from his fingers. He looked down at the spreading stain across his chest, eyes wide, not with fear, but with something older, recognition. He fell to his knees first, then onto his side, the dirt catching him with no ceremony. His breath rattled once, then again, fading like the last note of a song no one wished to sing. Elias stood still, revolver smoking in his hand. His chest rose heavy, not with triumph, but with the burden of what had been done. His hand lowered slowly, the weapon suddenly heavier than the land itself. From the porch, Ahyoka did not cheer, did not cry out. She only watched, her eyes reflecting the firelight, the silence between them louder than victory. The duel was over. The reckoning had come. The valley was quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of silence that follows thunder, heavy and unnatural. Elias lowered his revolver, smoke curling from the barrel, and stared at the man on the ground. Sheriff Caleb Brackett lay in the dirt, blood seeping into the ash, his badge dark with soot and stain. The lawman's chest rose shallow, fighting for air like a fish stranded on dry rock. Elias stepped closer, boots crunching on scorched earth. He looked down at the man he had once ridden beside, a comrade in battles that had long since blurred into nightmares. For a heartbeat, he saw not the sheriff, but the younger man, laughing around campfires, steady in the saddle, fearless under fire. Then the image burned away, leaving only what Brackett had become. The sheriff's lips moved. Elias knelt, straining to hear. The words came ragged, broken. Maybe a curse, Brackett rasped. His eyes flickered, glassy with pain. Maybe a prayer. Elias searched his face for the truth, but found none. Only the weight of choices that could not be undone. He stayed crouched, watching as the breath rattled out of the man, slower and slower, until there was nothing left but stillness. Behind him, Ahyoka approached. Her rifle hung loose at her side, blade tucked back at her belt. She did not look at Brackett. She looked at Elias. "You okay?" He rose slowly, holstering his revolver with deliberate care. His nod was slight, heavy. Not the nod of victory, but of a man at a grave. From the ridges, the last of Brackett's men had already scattered. Their shadows melted into the night, unwilling to die for a leader already gone. The ranch was scarred, half the corral eaten by flame, the barn nothing but a frame of ruin. The air stank of smoke and blood, but it was quiet now. Elias looked across the land he had built with his own hands, now blackened, broken. He thought of Mary, of the years he had spent running from the world, hiding behind fences. And now the fences were gone, burned away in one night of reckoning. His hand brushed the revolver at his hip. It felt heavier than ever, as though it carried not just bullets, but the weight of silence, choices, and blood spilled on soil that would remember. Ahyoka stood beside him, eyes sharp but unreadable. She didn't thank him. She didn't smile. She only breathed, steady, alive. And in her presence, Elias felt the truth settle deep. This wasn't triumph, it was survival. And survival carried its own burden. The firelight dimmed as the wind shifted east, carrying ash into the night sky. Somewhere out there, the town of Cold Pine slept, unaware that their sheriff lay dead in the dirt, his law ended with a single shot. Elias turned toward the horizon, his voice low, more to the wind than to anyone. Lord, have mercy on him. On me. And with that, the climax of fire and blood closed, leaving only silence and the long shadow of what came next. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. Morning came slow, gray and heavy over the scarred land. The smoke still lingered, curling upward in thin, bitter ribbons that carried the stench of ash and blood. The corral was half-eaten, the barn nothing but blackened beams, reaching into the sky like broken fingers. Elias moved through the yard with a shovel in hand. The earth was hard, baked by years of drought and last night's fire. Each strike of the blade rang sharp in the silence. He did not count the graves. There was no point. The men who had come here had left their lives in the dirt, and Elias gave them no markers, no words, only soil to cover what was done. Ahyoka worked beside him, dragging bodies with quiet strength, her knife still at her belt. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The rhythm of labor was enough. Dig, drag, cover. Dust clung to their faces, mixing with the soot that hadn't washed away. By the time the sun was high, the ground bore its witness, a row of mounds, nameless, faceless, forgotten. When the last grave was filled, Elias leaned on the shovel, shoulders heavy. Sweat cut lines through the grime on his skin. He stared at the mounds, at the soil already crusting dry. No victory lay there, only silence, the kind he knew too well. "They'll send more," Ahyoka said finally. Her voice was raw but steady. Elias nodded. Maybe. He glanced toward the horizon, where Cold Pine sat quiet, unaware, or perhaps pretending not to know. Maybe not soon. Men like Brackett don't die without leaving cracks behind. Town might eat itself before it looks this way again. Ahyoka wrapped her arms around herself, blanket long since burned away. Her eyes lingered on the graves, then shifted to the cabin. "You can't stay here." Elias followed her gaze. The cabin still stood, but its windows were black with soot, the porch scorched, the roof half charred. His refuge had become a ruin. He let out a breath that felt older than his bones. "No," he said, "I can't." For a long while they stood in the silence, the wind rattling what was left of the barn. Finally, Ahyoka turned, her voice quieter now. "My sister waits for me, north, near Red Basin. She thought I was already gone. If I can reach her—" She trailed off, but her eyes carried the rest. Hope, fragile but alive. Elias studied her, the bruises on her neck, the scar across her palm, the steel in her gaze. She had survived a rope, a fire, and a night that should have ended her. And still she looked forward. "You'll make it," he said simply. She tilted her head, considering him. "And you?" Elias looked at the land again, scarred, blackened, marked with blood and fire. The fences had fallen, the barn was gone. What remained wasn't a home, it was a grave. "South," he said at last. "There's a trail to Denver. Mary Hendricks still needs an escort. Long road, but maybe that's what's left for me. Not silence, just unfinished work." Ahyoka's eyes softened for the first time since he'd cut her down. She reached out, laid a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't thanks, it wasn't farewell. It was acknowledgement, a bond carved not by choice, but by fire. The sun dipped lower, painting the graves in long shadows. The wind shifted east, carrying the smell of char away. For the first time in years, Elias didn't feel the weight of silence pressing in. He felt its absence, like a gate swinging open. "Then we ride at first light," Ahyoka said. Elias nodded. The world had burned, but not everything had been lost. Not yet. Dawn rose soft across the valley, light spilling over the ashes of what had been. The smoke had thinned, the air still heavy but gentler than the night before. For the first time, the ranch lay quiet. Not the silence of hiding, but the hush that follows reckoning. Elias saddled his horse with slow, deliberate motions. The leather creaked, familiar, steady. He tightened the straps, checked the cinch, his hands moving out of habit more than thought. Nearby, Ahyoka adjusted the reins on a mare they had found wandering after the blast, dust still clinging to its mane. Neither spoke for a long while. Words seemed too small for what they carried. When everything was ready, they rode together until the trail split at the edge of the basin. One path bent north, winding into redstone canyons and pine-shadowed ridges. The other stretched south, across open plains, a road long and lonely toward Denver. They stopped where the tracks forked, dismounting in the early light. "This is it," Elias said. His voice was rough, as though the smoke still clung to his throat. Ahyoka nodded. She looked north, toward the mountains where her sister waited. Hope flickered across her face, fragile but alive. "If she's still there." "She's waiting," Elias said firmly. "I reckon she's waiting." The girl studied him, as though weighing the truth in his words. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, the first real smile he had seen from her. "And you?" she asked. Elias looked south. The land stretched wide, scarred but open. He thought of Mary Hendrick, a widow in Denver who had written for help, of the long road ahead, of the faces he might yet save if he kept riding. The fences were gone. Silence was gone, but work remained. "Not lonely," he said at last, "just unfinished." Ahyoka's gaze softened. She reached out, laying her hand briefly on his arm. It was not a plea, nor a farewell, but an anchor, a moment of recognition that neither had to speak aloud. For a time, they stood together at the fork, the wind brushing past like a benediction. Above them, a hawk circled, its cry sharp and clear against the morning. Elias turned his eyes to the sky, and a verse stirred in him, unbidden but steady. "The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." Exodus 14:14. Mary had once read it to him on a night much like this, when the world felt heavy and uncertain. Now it carried a different weight, not the call to silence, but to trust. Ahyoka mounted first, the mare restless beneath her. She gathered the reins, looked once more at Elias. "You gave me back more than breath," she said softly. "You gave me time. I won't waste it." Elias inclined his head. "Then go. Live." She spurred her horse north, the sound of hooves fading into the canyon. Elias watched until she was only a shadow against the rising sun, then gone. For a long moment he remained at the fork, the dust of her trail drifting east. His horse shifted beneath him, eager for the miles ahead. He adjusted the brim of his hat, settled into the saddle, and turned south. The land opened before him, scarred but alive. Each hoofbeat carried him farther from what had been and closer to what might still be. Behind him lay ashes, silence broken. Ahead waited a road without promise, but with purpose. Sometimes a man builds fences to keep the world out. Sometimes the world burns them down. And sometimes, when the smoke clears, all that remains is the choice to ride forward. Elias Harper rode on, not in triumph, not in peace, but in faith that unfinished work was still worth doing. Stories like Elias and Ahyoka's remind us that the Wild West was never just about gunfights or dusty trails. It was about the human heart, about men and women standing firm when silence would have been easier, about courage born not from glory, but from necessity. For some of you watching, these struggles may echo memories of your own youth, times when you chose to do what was right even when the world turned its face away. Perhaps it reminds you of loved ones long gone, or of the values your family carried across generations. That is why we share these true Wild West stories, not just to relive the past, but to keep alive the faith, resilience, and hope that shaped it. If this story touched you, don't let it end here. Subscribe, share, and join us for the next journey into the untold heart of the frontier.